So I appreciate the invitation to come on and, just like everyone in the growing and processing fields, the testing field is coming along. We haven't been here forever, so we've had a lot of lessons learned along the way. So here are a couple of questions I hope to answer today to help out a little bit. What to test and when to test for it, probably the number one question that I get called for. We've seen some common issues starting to pop up with different analysis types. So I want to highlight that. Dr. Pike mentioned our ISO accreditation. I wanted to be very straight about what that means because it doesn't always mean what people think. And then just have a slide on some general sampling and submission tips. So to start off with, typical services you're going to find at a lab pretty much across the board. Cannabinoids, sometimes called potency. This is useful for legal compliance. We also see a lot of folks using it for the intermediates or works in progress, crude extracts, in order to find the concentration of that and do the math to figure out their dilution into oil or how much to add to a product to get their target final cannabinoid percentage. And also to confirm the final product labeling. The general rule that, as we understand it, is your label should be plus or minus 10% from your test, or the other way around. Your test should hit plus or minus 10% from your label. Terpenes, as Dr. Reed mentioned, is flavor profile and product labeling. And then microbial, pesticides, mycotoxins, metal solvents, but usually is bundled together as full panel testing. And this is really focused mostly on safety testing, but for final products for particularly human consumption or topical applications. But we also see a lot of folks concerned with protecting their extraction equipment from contamination. I can tell you, particularly on the pesticides front, that is a problem. But I want to go through each of these individually. So cannabinoids, I'm sure most of you know, delta-9, THC, THCA, CBD, CBDA, and so on and so forth. Different labs you come across are going to have a different subset of these. But for the most part, the core will be there with anyone you work with. As I mentioned, legal compliance is probably the number one reasoning behind samples that we see submitted to our lab. USDA finalized their rule recently, and VDAX from the beginning has been requiring total THC. And, this is the dry weight post decarboxylation measure of THC content. There's plenty of debate about what the Farm Bill reads and whether it's off delta-9 only and all of that. And I'll leave that for someone else to debate or legal teams. But the two common methods that you're going to find are direct analysis of this dried decarboxylated plant material by a method called GCFID. Basically, there's the samples are decarbed in the process. The GC is it's a very hot method, so there's no way around it other than some scientific tricks. But basically, it's a direct measure. It converts everything to the decarb delta-9. This has been the method that's been preferred by VDAX in the past. I don't, certainly don't speak for them, and so their opinions may change. But compliance testing over the last couple of years has been through that method. The other way that you'll hear a lot about is HPLC analysis, and this separates out the delta-9, the THCA, CBD and CBDA, and so on. And so when you're looking at total THC using this method, it's a calculation that's done at the end. To get the dry weight, you also include the percent moisture. And so you'll see a lot of times on the bottom of your COA an equation like this, total THC. I do get questions sometimes about it's delta-9 plus only a percentage of the THCA, and that's just a mathematical correction for essentially when you decarb, you're losing the A off of that THCA. And so the 0.877 is the theoretical weight that you would have left. And then a moisture correction. And as I mentioned already, this is definitely important for accurate product labeling for your customers to know how much their CBD or CBG or whatnot they're getting per dose. So some issues that come up, nice to have this on the heels of Dr. Reed's data. The CBD cultivars usually are hot if you let them go all the way to maturity. So really what we see people doing who don't go hot are testing along the way. A lot of times we see starting around week 4 or 6 after flower, and then every 2 weeks or so. Certainly not necessary to do it every couple of days, but really that's the way to keep your crops from going hot. Everyone's still at the 0.3% total THC limit right now, and so until the laws change, that's my recommendation, to make sure that you don't have to destroy your crop and lose your investment. This next bullet, I actually may have to rethink based on this data, because we've seen up to a 50% difference in cannabinoids from the top to the very bottom of a plant. There were some smaller differences in the data that was just presented. So maybe this is too large of a number. This is only done on one plant one time. But the point here is that if you're trying to take a representative sample of your crop, you really want to take a collection of random samples, top, middle, bottom, different plants, larger ones, smaller ones. Not seeing a correlation between the larger plants having larger cannabinoid numbers. We've actually seen some of the smaller, more stressed ones have THC and CBD that shoots up a little bit faster. Obviously, your yield is just lower. And then lab to lab variability is going to be something that we're just going to continue to face for years. Right now, there are no industry standardized methods as there are in environmental testing and pharmaceutical testing. So that variability seems to get larger with more difficult products to handle. So particularly things that are not soluble on the chemistry side, we really need to get things into solution. So getting beeswax into solution, or even gummies and things like that, can be difficult. So each lab has their own way of doing that. It causes some variability there. So that's something we're going to face for a long time. I haven't seen a whole lot of movement on standardization across the industry right now. So I hope to, but we're not there yet. I do want to mention Delta 8 and Delta 10 THC products. This is one thing that tends to surprise people. They'll get a report back and there will be some Delta 9 reported in there. And the belief was that there was no Delta 9 in that product. And we dug deeper on some of these projects and found that there are multiple Delta 9 isomers. So this gets into a legal battle of exo Delta 9 or these other isomers, are they illegal? And I don't necessarily want to go that route either, but I just want you to be aware that when you're forming these Delta 8, Delta 10 products, you do get a lot of side products and isomers and things that complicate the analysis. And you may see things that you didn't expect to see. I've heard in a lot of cases Delta 10 showing up as CBC instead of Delta 10. And in my hands, they're very close together when they come out of our instruments. So just some issues that we're living with right now and on the lab side working to face, but that you should be aware of possible. Terpenes, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on. I ripped this image off of the internet, so I take no credit for it. Right now, terpenes testing is really about product labeling. If you claim it to be high in something, then you really just need to have some proof of it. For the medical marijuana side in Virginia right now, they are requiring terpenes as part of the ingredients labeling. I'm not sure if that will transition to the CBD market. It seems to me like it'll probably stay an optional thing. Just put it on the label, have a test to back it up. We don't really see a ton of issues with terpenes. I would say the biggest thing is you do lose them when you're drying. So there's a difference in drying and curing. And I would look into that. If you really want to preserve your terpenes, I would really look into curing. Maybe seek out some experienced marijuana growers from other legal states to help out with that, or other folks in Virginia. There are some folks certainly doing well with that in Virginia. And then I want to go through the safety tests individually and talk about some different things. the number one is microbial contamination. And I think going forward, this is probably going to be one of the more challenging ones. Right now, we are basically basing everything off this USP 1111 criteria, and that comes from the medical marijuana program, and that's also part of the BDAC's hemp extracts intended for human consumption. Their microbial limits are based on these criteria. They are different. What we have to look for on the lab side is different based on if it's orally consumed, inhaled, topical, or 10 other routes of administration. So if you just search, I was going to try to put some links in here, but I wasn't sure if that would be helpful. So if you just search USP 1111 criteria, you'll see what I mean. But these numbers are very low compared to what you'll see from lab tests. So this is going to be something to experiment with a little bit on the enforcement of these rules. So when should you test for microbials? Flower biomass, particularly outdoor grown stuff, your numbers are going to be off the charts. I'm talking about it. Your limits from USP 1111 for an inhalable product, for example, smokable flower, is about 200 CFUs per gram. And so you just think of that number, 200. We're seeing 10 million, pretty much on average. And so there's going to be some required remediation there. Indoor is obviously a lot lower. You don't have the environmental pressures, but there's a limited value in microbial testing for flower and biomass, particularly biomass that's going forward for processing, because many processing procedures will kill that, particularly heat and alcohol. So that brings me to the next bullet, concentrates and extracts. This is one of the areas where I would absolutely recommend testing your microbial and making sure that your processing is actually killing all the bacteria, yeast, and molds that you need to kill. It's kind of hit or miss. Sometimes it seems like it should be killing it, and you're only knocking down one. One being, you test bacteria and then yeast and mold separately. You see bacteria easier to knock down, yeast and mold are a little bit harder. And the yeast and mold limit is all the way down at 20 CFUs per gram. And in biomass, we're seeing that one in probably the 10,000 to 100,000 range, and you have to knock it all the way down to 20. So pretty substantial reductions that are required to pass these. Right now, it's only really being enforced for essentially CBD oils for human consumption, but as the regulations continue to expand and as the enforcement increases as well, I feel like this is going to be something that you really need to get a handle on. Final products, these are pretty easy to fail as well because of those low limits, but sometimes we see them not just from the product itself, but because once the final product is made, or even the extract is made, you still need to aseptically handle all of your materials into final packaging, and also if you're not sending an actual final package to the lab, you need to make sure that when you're taking your sample, you have gloves, you have utensils that you're transferring with. It's very easy just to wipe it down with an alcohol wipe or something like that. That should do the trick. And then the container you're using should be pre-sterilized as well. And that's probably one of the more common issues, is that we'll see small amounts pop up, and it's usually because of the containers. People just not realizing that they needed to sterilize those as well. And then the other common issue is just things not being heated enough, or a lot of things like more of the raw processed material like keef. If you're not keeping that in the freezer, then you will get an enhancement of those microbial colonies as well. So really the thing to do here is to test some and follow the data. Pesticides, right now, what you're probably going to find in most labs in Virginia is that we're testing for the Oregon pesticide list. It's 59 residues. for that list, I can use a search string here and look on page 11 of that. It also has the limits. The reason for that is the first regulations that came out just said test for all the things, and there's like 700 pesticides on the list. Of course, we all moaned and groaned and whined about that because it wasn't possible, and then they settled on the Oregon list, particularly for the medical marijuana folks, and it seems like that's probably going to trickle into the rest of the regulations as they develop. When we have seen pesticides required to be tested per contracts in soil and water pre-planting, that just kind of depends on the contract you have. So that is sometimes a thing. Biomass prior to extraction, this is a very important one, particularly if you have an extraction rig. I can tell you from my instrument, which is down in the bottom right-hand corner, that's cheap down there. Once you get some large amounts of pesticides stuck in the tubing and the valves and stuff, it takes forever to get it out of there. And I've been that route with that particular instrument, taken the whole thing apart, replaced all the tubing, pulled every valve, cleaned it. It's a nightmare. Concentrates and extracts, some pesticides don't survive harsh conditions, but most of them are fairly stable. So if you're concentrating your THC, CBD, CBG, you're also concentrating your pesticides as well. So you do want to make sure that even if you didn't see it in the biomass, we've seen cases where you're not seeing things in your biomass, and once you make your concentrate, it's 10 times more concentrated or 8 times more concentrated, you'll start to see some things pop up. And then certainly final product is for safety testing. Some of the issues we've seen for the organic farmers out there, there are some things on that Oregon list that you are supposed to be allowed to use on an organic farm and will pop up on these lists. So spinosad is the one that I see the most often. One of the other interesting problems is that we've seen some of these synergists that will be in these mixes. So one of the prime examples is piperonyl butoxide we've seen in a mix with pyrethrins, and the pyrethrins don't show up anymore. They decomposed or whatever, and piperonyl butoxide still shows up in the test months later. So consider the other ingredients that are in there and make sure that they're not on that Oregon list as well. And then we've seen some weird hit or miss problems with false positives from not just our labs, but a couple of others. And I think that kind of gets back a little bit at the needing more industry standards, proven out methods for everybody. And you do get some weird background signals sometimes from these plants. The cannabis plant has so much stuff in it, trying to identify this one little thing down to a level of parts per billion can get a little bit difficult. So it can lead to some false positives sometimes. Generally, if you suspect that, really the thing to do is to send another sample to a different lab and then compare them. That's the starting point that we've seen be most fruitful in terms of actually moving forward. Mycotoxins are kind of similar to pesticides and the problems that you face. These 4 aflatoxins and the ochratoxin A, those are the 5 you're going to see pretty much in any state and anywhere. They are produced by certain fungi, so if you let your stuff get, if you're not drying thoroughly, then you can definitely see problems with mycotoxins. This one also, testing your biomass prior to extraction or concentrate, it's probably not that helpful. We're looking for such small numbers on the mycotoxins test that you're unlikely to see it, and we have seen cases where you don't see it as a biomass, and then when you concentrate it, you do see them actually pop out. So I would probably start this one at the concentrates and extracts level, and then certainly confirmation for final products. Common issue, most likely to show up in concentrates. These are microbiology plates, but I needed a pretty picture for that one. So metals, we really don't see that much problem, just bottom line up front in this region. We're testing for arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury. That's pretty much the same across the United States. The idea is that they're most likely going to be pulled up out of the soil. I haven't seen a lot of examples of that. I know there's some research hoping to be done on soil remediation using cannabis. But we have seen generally, we'll see some lead, particularly towards Southside Virginia and North Carolina, pretty small amounts. And I haven't seen anything really manifest in plant material or products yet. That's not based on millions of data points, so take it for what it's worth. But we really haven't seen much happening in metals in terms of issues. Again, we do have some soil and water testing that's been required for contracts that we've seen. Biomass prior to extraction, I've seen some extractors require that, again, just to protect their investments and their extraction equipment. And then concentrates and extracts, metals aren't going anywhere. They don't decompose with alcohol or heat, anything like that. So they will concentrate as well. But even if you skip all of those steps, you should definitely at least do a final product metals analysis. I'd be surprised if you see anything from Virginia grown hemp, but you do need to have it on there as a final product check, a safety test. Common issues. We don't really see it in plants and products, but it's pretty typical to see at least a little bit of lead in the soil, particularly toward the south side of Virginia. Solvents. So this is really what people are testing for varies by lab in terms of the actual list of solvents. Most people hit the same basic set, and then there will be some differences here or there. But really, the source of these solvents anything that the processor does, right? These are not going to be naturally occurring in the plant. And so really what you should be looking for is whatever you put in there, make sure that you get it back out down to the required level. So biomass is not going to have any solvents. So don't even worry about that. Concentrates and extracts, that's where I would say to start with, because that's really where you're going to confirm that you've pulled out all of the ethanol or hydrocarbons or whatever. And then, of course, confirming that your final products have levels that are low enough. And we see a lot of things where you're not getting complete non-detective solvents, particularly ethanol. It's okay to have some in there. It may not be worth the extra effort. It may just be diminishing returns to try to get that last little bit out. So that leads me to the first common issue. I get calls all the time saying, but I removed it all. I had it in the vacuum oven. When this stuff is drying down, and I've been in a lot of different scenarios in chemistry labs, and I'm always trying to get solvent out. It seems like you can never get it all out. As it dries, some gets trapped in the matrix of whether things are crystallizing or they're just packing into a crude or a cake. It's almost impossible to get that last little bit out. The other thing that I see pop up and have a lot of conversations about is folks will say, well, I only used ethanol, but then your test says there's methanol and isopropyl alcohol in there. We've seen with hydrocarbons where someone thinks they're only using pentane, not realizing that the pentane has other isomers in it, and so you'll get this spread of different components on your solvents test. Nothing that you're buying is 100% pure. And so don't be too surprised if you see those. I mean, you should still see the main one you're using be the larger number, and then you may see some smaller numbers here or there. But it can be difficult to sort that out versus false positives. That's one thing right now that I've seen pop up in different scenarios, and try to work through with folks. What their lab really should be doing, any lab really should be doing, is having blanks that test the lab air alongside the real samples when they're doing solvents. Because keep in mind in the lab, like this picture here is from my cabinet. We use solvents as well, and they're volatile. They are in the air, and we have fume hoods in circulation and all of that to try to keep it cleared out for many reasons. it says my internet connection is unstable, so I hope I'm okay. But labs should really be testing just the lab air before your sample and after it. That way, if something pops up in your sample, you're in the middle of that, and you can say, no, it was clean before, it's clean after. So this is a real sample or a real result for your sample. And if there's ever a question, you should be able to ask your lab. Say, show me your quality controls, show me the blanks on both sides. This one is from the lab side. This one is a little difficult, and we're testing down to the parts per billion. So if you can smell something in the air, that the instrument can read it. And so that's the end of the particular tests. The bottom line with ISO 17025, you're going to see this become more and more required from labs. It's definitely a good thing, but it does not guarantee that anybody did anything right. What it guarantees is that we wrote down what we did. And we have documentation all the way to the beginning. So you'll see the chain of custody and that kind of thing when you're submitting samples. That's really the start of the tracking of your sample, when it changed hands and between who, and show that there was no swap out or contamination in the middle. But on the lab side, we track every standard that we bought, every solvent, what was used to mix together to make our calibration standards, all of our quality controls for every batch that go with your samples. All of that is very thoroughly documented and have criteria that they have to fit within. And that's really what you get with ISO is this legal defensibility. It doesn't say that we did it right. It says that we can come to court for you and say, from the beginning to the end, here's the whole story of what happened and why it's supported. And especially right now with the lab-to-lab variability issues, lack of standardized methods, that's really what you want from your lab, is to have that documentation. Obviously, you want them to be right, but there's a little bit of a gray area about what's right, what the right numbers are. So having that documentation behind your COA is the most important thing right now. And you can verify these things. So this is our logo or whatever you call it from our accreditation. You should be able to find these kind of things for anybody you work with, and you should be able to independently verify them. We can be suspended and don't necessarily have to say anything about it. So you can verify the status. And you can also verify what is included in that accreditation, because the cannabinoids accreditation is separate from pesticides, separate from microbial. They can all be on the same form, but they're different fields of testing. And each one is independently reviewed, verified by these third-party auditors. And each one has their own set of requirements. And so it's not just get one and it applies to everything. Each one is individual. And so you want to make sure that any test you get is covered by that accreditation. And then some general guidance on sampling. So for THC compliance, I don't want to get too much on the regulatory side of things, as I said before, but based on prior experience last year and the year before that, the best thing to do is take 3 to 5 inch samples from the top of the plant. I've heard some talk of maybe now the top 1/3. I'll leave that up to the folks on Thursday to discuss from VDAX. Think about representative sampling here. You don't want to just take one sample. I would take 3 to 5 inch sample from 4 different plants. Cured flower, same thing. As we were talking about before, the difference in the top and the bottom of the plant, especially if you have everything bucked and cured or dried, whatever you're doing, try to take a couple of random samples from different areas, throw them all in a bag. You don't necessarily have to grind them all together or anything. The lab will do that for you. Things that are mixed, like oils and tinctures and things like that, a little easier to have a homogeneous sample as long as you're processing, mix it all together. And then the products that are sold per unit, this one is an interesting one for me because a lot of times what you'll see, like in gummies, for example, is you'll see the actual concentration of CBD will be the same, but the weight of a gummy will from one to the next will vary. So definitely send 3 or 4 at least. My favorite number is actually 7. And we take the average weight of those 7, and then we'll test 1 or 2. But then we'll report it out in milligrams per unit, and that unit would be the average of those 7. It really gives you the best average potency of those. In terms of packaging, the only one that I have a specific recommendation on is wet flour. Putting that in paper bags. It does help when it's being mailed. It helps dry it out a little bit, helps it not get moldy. These things can get moldy pretty quickly, 24 to 48 hours in a sealed plastic bag, particularly fresh field cut samples. Other than that, anything that doesn't let it spill is good enough. Of course, as I said before, if you're submitting for microbial contamination, make sure it's sterile. But other than that, labs are really not that specific on what containers you use. The big thing is clearly labeling them and completing all the paperwork. I said, and the paperwork does vary by lab, but as I mentioned, that is the start of that legal documentation. Unfortunately, something were to happen, or someone came after you for some reason. Shipping is still a bit of an issue. It's definitely gotten better. October through December was awful, but still always recommend hand delivering. Second choice is USPS, and third choice, UPS is doing pretty well as well. We have a lot of problems with FedEx confiscating based purely on odor. So if you're sending oils or gummies or something like that, FedEx would be fine. But if your package has that cannabis odor, they will take it pretty much every time. So keep that in mind. But with that, that's everything I have. My contact info is here. If you have any questions,